Hello everyone, my name is Natalie Sorrell-Charlesworth, and on behalf of the LitFest Board of Trustees, I'd like to welcome you to this 42nd Lancaster Literature Festival. As many of you know, after a successful opening weekend, LitFest 2020 had to be cancelled due to COVID-19. So for this year's festival, our volunteer board realised it had to work in a very different way and decided to create a diverse and inclusive festival to be delivered completely free and entirely online. With support from Lancaster City Council, an Arts Council England project grant, and our sponsors and partners, our aim, as we near the end of this very long winter lockdown, has been to bring ashore a rich cargo of fiction, poetry, illustration and ideas, plus all kinds of activities and challenges in the form of a free online festival. And as a registered charity with no regular Arts Council funding, if we are to be able to go on creating exciting projects and events, bringing the best in world literature and ideas to the northwest of England and to our international audiences too, we are going to need your help. During the event, a donate button will appear at the bottom of the screen, probably during the online Q&A. But depending on your connectivity, you may prefer to visit our website once the event is over. And our website is www.litfest.org. Every gift will help us to build towards a future where we can actually meet in person again. But for now, although physically distanced, we are socially together. So, welcome to this third double bill of our Poetry Day. We are delighted to welcome Doireann Ní Ghríofa and Raymond Antrobus. Doireann is going to read first, followed by Raymond, and there will be a Q&A portion at the end of the event. So you may be able to see in the bottom right hand of your screen, bottom right corner, the Ask a Question box. Or if you're not an Apple or a Mac, it might just literally look like a little box with a question mark in. If you go in there, you can place your questions at any time in the event, and I'll be able to pick them up when we get to the end to put to our wonderful poets. So first up, we have Doireann Ní Ghríofa, who is a poet and essayist and the author of 6 critically acclaimed books of poetry, including Clasp and To Star the Dark. Awards for her writing include a Lannan Literary Fellowship, the Astana Prize, a Seamus Heaney Fellowship, and the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature. Ghost in the Throat, her most recent publication, was awarded Book of the Year at the Irish Book Awards in 2020. And I should say as well that for the majority of the titles from our authors during the festival, you can buy them from our LitFest bookshop, often, though not always, with the option of a free signed bookplate by the author. This will also help to support the festival, not just in the form of donation, and this way you get a book too. And we all like that as literature festival goers. So I'd love to hand over now to Doireann to let her do her reading.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Agus is méise Doireann agus bhfuilm Solidosium. I'd like to express my gratitude to Bill and to Natalie and Saul, and especially to Raymond. It's so nice to meet old friends in poetry, and I've admired his work for so long, and it's very strange because the only time we met was on the other side of the world in New Zealand and on a crazy adventure down there. So it's great to be back at another festival of literature together, and I just wish that we were all there together in person. But it's also a great pleasure to be speaking to you from the comfort of my own home. So I suppose I shouldn't complain. And thanks to everyone out there as well for being here with us this evening. It's great to see so many people attending such a great festival. So I'm going to begin by just telling you a little bit about myself. I'm a bilingual writer. I speak and I write in both Irish and in English. And I think I'm lucky to have this amphibious kind of artistic practice because it means that I draw breath in two very different linguistic environments and very different histories and cultures that those languages carry embedded within themselves. And I was speaking recently, and I had to write a lecture for an event, and I came back to a quotation by Hertha Müller as I was writing that has come to mean a lot to me over the years. And in the way of these things, while I was preparing the lecture, it was almost like that quotation was like an earworm that got stuck in my head. And in the time since I've given the lecture, I still keep thinking about it. And it's such a simple line she wrote, or she said within the speech: each language has different eyes sitting inside its words. And I found that so fascinating, because it's something that I suppose I've really felt to be true for me in my own artistic practice. Speaking both Irish and English, it does allow me, I think, to perceive the world differently through two very different sets of eyes. And I think it is a gift to be able to see the world twice. So I think I'll begin by reading a poem about just about that, really. It began with our Irish word for freckle, which is Pógin Gréine, and that translates directly to English as kisses from the sun, or sun kisses. So that's a poem in itself, I suppose. And I foolishly tried to tap it by writing a poem about it. Pógin Gréine. Scapan bricíní Gréine gruthid de fróne, mar bheadh ball óga an chreiceann na mraic. Is nábhan anis trí scáhanna is cholas ómra ag dul le shrá. The freckles on the bridge of your nose sing loud now of the speckled skin of a trout, one who swims out through shallow glooms and amber beams, a dapper changeling swerving upstream. I'm going to read a couple of poems from my newest book, which has just been published, and it's called To Star the Dark. There it is. And like a lot of my work, this poem speaks to the connections between women, even across time, which is something I find myself coming back to again and again in my work. And it also speaks to the female body itself. All while bleeding. In a vintage boutique on Sullivan's Quay, I lift a winter coat with narrow bodice, neat lapels, tight waist, a fallen hem. It's far too expensive for me, but the handwritten label 1915 brings it to my chest in armfuls of red. In that year, someone drew a blade through a bolt of fabric and stitched this coat into being. I carry it to the dressing room, slip my arms in. Silk lining spills against my skin. To clasp the belt is to draw a slow breath as a cramp curls again, where blood stirs and melts. In glass, I am wrapped in old red. Red pinched into girl cheeks and smeared from torn knees. Lipstick blotted in tissue, scarlet concealed in pale sheets. All the red that fell into pads and rags. The weight of red. The weight for red that we share. In the mirror, the coat blushes. This pocket may once have sheltered something precious, a necklace, a love letter, or a fresh egg, feather warm, held gently so it couldn't crack, couldn't leak through seams, so it couldn't stain the dress. The next poem that I'll read is from the first book that I ever wrote in English, which is called Clasp. And that was a very strange process for me initially, to come from writing only in the Irish language and begin trying to write in English. And this poem is one that came from, it came to me in the kind of raw and blissful and strange days of early motherhood. And at the time, we lived just next to a factory, a brewery that made, like we'd say, porter, kind of like Guinness, but like the version from the south of Ireland, Murphy's. So like ale or beer, stout. I don't know. I'm not an aficionado of these kind of things, so I don't know what you might call it. But we live in a city and in a place where I suppose I'll always be a stranger. It's funny, isn't it? Even on such a small island, because I came from the West, whereas my children who are like their father and his father and their father's father, they were all born and bred here in the city. And I suppose there's, at a very micro level, a kind of estrangement there, even when they were babies, and a getting used to that, and a sense of our family navigating our way around those kind of issues. Home from hospital, you doze in my arm, all eyelashes, cheeks, and raw umbilical, swaddled in the heavy black smells of the brewery. Your great-grandfathers worked all their lives in that factory. Every day they were there, breathing the same air, hoisting barrels, sweating over vats where bubbles rose like fat. At dusk, they poured into pubs and ordered porter. Neat black pints lidded with white silk, thick as cream from frothing milk. And their replies were always the same: the gasp, the nod. Down gullets and guts went the porter, went the pay, went the nights and days, coins slapped on the counter, no change. In my arms you stir, 1,000 street lamps flickered light in the dusk. As I watch your eyes open, the reek of roasting hops knits a blanket of scent around us. I'm just going to take a little sip of water. So, as well as writing poetry, I also write prose. And this book, A Ghost in the Throat, really grew, I suppose, from my fascination with one of the most celebrated poems in the Irish literary tradition. It would have been very much studied as well in England, I know, and attended to there too. And it's called Queen Arthí Lira, this poem. It's an 18th-century Queen or Lament poem, in which a woman named Eibhlín Dubh Ní Chonail grieves the sudden heartbreaking murder of her husband. And during a really exhausting season of my own life, while mothering four very young children, and the kind of whirlwind of tiredness that comes with that, I found myself returning to reread this poem again and again, without fully understanding to begin with where this compulsion was coming from. But I do believe that when we read a poet's words aloud, that we give breath to their voice, and that we invite something of them to inhabit our space and our lives, and that we can almost conjure their living presence somehow. So the more I returned to that poem and revisited it again and again, the more real Eibhlín Dubh herself, the poet who had composed it, began to feel to me. And one day I set out to find out more about her life, and that brought me on a weird kind of adventure. And so A Ghost in the Throat is a book that follows that adventure, and it's a weird true story in which Eibhlín Dubh is alive, and so is someone who looks an awful lot like me. So in order to try and find what her life was like, I began by attending to the poem itself and all the translations that had been made of it. And the only way that I could access that was through our amazing library system. So the extract that I'm going to read occurs within a library. Look. It is a Tuesday morning, and a security guard in a creased blue uniform is unlocking a door and stepping aside with a light-hearted bow. Because look, now, here I come, with my hair scraped into a rough bun, a milk-stained blouse, a baby in a sling, a toddler in a buggy, a nappy bag spewing books, and what could only be described as a dangerous light in my eyes. I know that I have a 6-minute window at best before the screeching begins, so I'm unclipping the buggy fast, faster now, and urging the toddler upstairs. No stopping. I peek into the sling where tiny eyelids swipe in sleep, then plonk the toddler by my feet and, eyes darting around in search of the librarian who once chastised me, I shove a forbidden banana into his face. Please, I whisper, please, just sit still while Mammy just. I tug a wrinkled list from the nappy bag, my fingertips racing the spines. The sling squirms and the baby rips an extravagant blast into his nappy. I smile. How could I not? And yank the last 2 books from the shelf. I am grinning as I kiss the toddler's hair, grinning as I hoist my cargo sideways, step by slow step down the stairs, with one gooey banana hand in mine and a very familiar smell rising from the sling. This is how a woman in my situation comes to chase down every translation of Eibhlín Dubh's words, of which there are many, necessitating many such library visits. Few come close enough to her voice to satiate me, though, and the accompanying pages on her broader circumstances are often so sparse that they leave me hungry. Not just hungry, I'm starving. I long to know more of her life, both before and after the moment of composition. I want to know who she was, where she came from, and what happened next. I want to know what became of her children and grandchildren. I want to lay flowers on her grave. I want to know her and to know her life, and I am lazy. So I want to find all these answers laid out easily before me, preferably in a single library book. The literature available to me, however, is uninterested in answering such peripheral curiosities. Still, I search, because I'm convinced that there must be a text in existence somewhere that shares my wonder. And the spoiler alert is the book that I wanted to read, that I described there, didn't exist. So I had to write it myself. And that's what's contained here in A Ghost in the Throat. Okay, back to the poems we go then. And this one again is from the new book. And it occurs through a screen in a similar way that this encounter is occurring through screens too. And it's called A Snippet 5.6 seconds long of a subterranean waterfall. So fast this child learns to scroll and swipe. When he finds my phone, he hides, sliding past his own old eyes until he reaches his favourite clip. Alwee again. There it is. The cave, the cave, the same old darkness. The waterfall lit by a dozen flashes, which he watches as we did, transfixed. Every time he touches it, it spills again to his fingertip, obedient and quick. Again he presses play, and again the dark wakes, filling the screen with falling amber flames. He stares, and we stare at his face, how it reflects that past even as it turns away, luminous, luminous, and suddenly strange. So the next poem is kind of like, it's a really strange poem, and I wasn't sure whether I should read it. I don't think I've ever actually read it in public before, and it's a little bit embarrassing because it's kind of a love letter to my film star crush, who was called Friedrich Gustav Maximilian Schreck, and in his most famous role, he played Nosferatu in Murnau's silent film in 1922, and I just love him in a way that I used to, like everyone else, really fall for movie stars when I was a teenager. I love him. I love him so much. And one of my favorite and very embarrassing things to do online is to look at a little GIF of him from that film where he's playing Nosferatu and he's just standing at a window looking out. And I've been really interested for a long time with GIFs, with these brief repeating clips that you can engage with online or in text messages and WhatsApp and stuff. How there's kind of a reciprocity there, that whoever is being depicted in the GIF is being forced to repeat this loop again and again, and how close that can feel, I suppose, sometimes to our own behaviours, where we sometimes feel trapped in that kind of a loop as well, or maybe it's just me. So this is about Friedrich and about the GIF that he has been trapped in, and that I'm also very much complicit in. And this poem is called Charm and the Cage. Here our gaze cannot break, because here my screen binds our stares. In this GIF you exist, Friedrich, you do. I click it to resurrect you, bringing you back as Nosferatu, your grip still firm on a splintered pane, your nails still clipped into cartoon blades. In Slovakia, I know it grew cold the day they filmed your castle stair. You wandered away and found a forest there, where you lost yourself in thornberries, in birdsong and sweet cold air. Decades later, in interviews, the crew still spoke of how peculiar you seemed, how weird this man, calm only in the company of trees. But Friedrich, dear Friedrich, your clenched jaw remembered the trenches, didn't it? The screaming horses, the bloodied bayonets, the stench of corpses. There, there. Now you can rest, my handsome marionette. Your ghost is safe, you mustn't fret. I've saved you here in my screen, cherished captive, peering back at me. Okay, I think I will leave it at that, because I want to be sure to leave plenty of time where I can relax and enjoy Raymond's beautiful reading. Is that okay, Natalie?
That's more than okay. Don't worry. Thank you very much for that. And a great ending. After our first wonderful reading, I would now like to welcome Raymond Antrobus. He was born in Hackney to an English mother and a Jamaican father. He is the author of Shapes Disfigurements from 2012, to Sweeten Bitter 2017, and The Perseverance from 2018, for which, in 2019, he became the first ever poet to be awarded the Rathbone Folio Prize for the best work of literature in any genre. His new collection, All the Names Given, is due in September from Picador / Tin House, so there's more coming later this year. So, over to Raymond.
Hello. Okay, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Doireann. That was such an amazing reading. And yeah, we met in New Zealand a few years ago, which was one of my favorite poetry festival experiences ever. So an honor to be in your presence again. And yeah, we'll see what happens in our discussion as well. I love the way that you honor the body, and you spoke so much about the body and different languages, inhabiting them and bringing that to life through memory and language. So yeah, I think I'm going to read from The Perseverance, which came out a few years ago now. And it opens with a quote, which is kind of a misheard quote, which is here at the beginning of the book. It says, "There is no telling what language is inside the body." And this was actually a mishearing line. I attended a poetry reading by an amazing poet called Robin Coast Lewis, a poet from New Orleans, currently the poet laureate of Los Angeles. And the line that she actually said was, "There is no telling what languishes inside the body." And I wrote it as "language is inside the body." And the way in which the book begins and or follows from that idea. When I lost my dad, I went to Barcelona on my own, you know, a few days after I'd lost him, and I just needed to be in an environment which I was unfamiliar with. But I couldn't sentimentalize, and I had no kind of emotional baggage with it. So I end up in Barcelona somehow in Gaudi's Cathedral, and I'm taking the audio guide there. And when you take the audio guide, it tells you that there are kind of different histories to different sections of the building. You know, how different parts of the building was built, and what the kind of philosophy of it is. And there's a particular part where it talks about how the building was built as a kind of idea to contain holy sound. And that stayed with me because I was having that experience through my hearing aids. So I'm having that experience artificially, and I'm wondering, are deaf people included in this idea of holy sound, of sacred sound? Do we get to experience sound the way that it's understood that angels do? And so I wrote this poem called Echo. My ear amps whistle as if singing to Echo, goddess of noise, the rabbled knot of tongues, of blaring birds, consonant crumbs, of dull doorbells, sound swamped in my misty hearing aid tubes. Gaudi believed in holy sound and built a cathedral to contain it, pulling hearing men from their knees as though deafness was a kind of atheism. Who would turn down God? Even though I have not heard the golden decibel of angels, I have been living in a noiseless palace where the doorbell is pulsating light, and I am able to answer. What? A word that keeps looking in mirrors in love with its own volume. What? I am a one-word question, a one-man patience test. What? What language would we speak without ears? What? Is paradise a world where I hear everything? What? How will my brain know what to hold if it has too many arms? The day I clear out my dead father's flat, I throw away boxes of molding LPs, Garvey, Malcolm X, Mandela, speeches on vinyl. I find a TDK cassette tape on the shelf. The smudged green label reads Raymond speaking. I play the tape in his vintage cassette player and hear my 2-year-old voice chanting my name, Antrob, and Dad's laughter crackling in the background, not knowing I couldn't hear the word bus and wouldn't until I got my hearing aids. Now I sit here listening to the space of deafness. Antrob, Antrob, Antrob. And if you don't catch nothing, then something wrong with your eyes. They've been tuned to the wrong frequency. So maybe I belong to the universe underwater, where all songs are smeared wailings for Salacia, goddess of salt water, healer of infected ears, which is what the doctor thought I had, since deafness did not run in the family but came from nowhere. So they syringed olive oil and salt water, and we all waited to see what would come out. And no one knew what I was missing, until a doctor gave me a handful of Lego and said to put a brick on the table every time I heard a sound. After the test, I still held enough bricks in my hand to build a house and call it my sanctuary. Call it the reason I sat in saintly silence during my grandfather's sermons, where he preached the good news I only heard as Babylon's babbling echoes. So that's how the perseverance begins. And I think I'll just read a poem which appears in the middle of the book, which is called Deaf School, and it's a poem which I came across by beloved English poet Ted Hughes, and in this poem, which he was commissioned to write, the commission he was given was how do people live without language? And he went to a deaf school in London, and he spent a day sitting in a classroom in a deaf school and just kind of observing deaf young children with this idea in his mind that deaf people don't have language. And I went to a deaf school, and so reading this poem made me think, wow, you know, that this is a kind of assault, because the poem that comes out of Ted Hughes calls deaf young children unaware, simple pool, lacking a dimension, removed from the vibration of air. So this is all imagery from a Ted Hughes poem. And so I wanted to kind of respond to that in a kind of way that revises what Ted Hughes has said. And using all of the imagery that he'd used, I wanted to redirect it back towards Ted Hughes in this poem. And it's a tricky one because there's so much of Ted Hughes which I loved. Hawk in the Rain was one of the first poetry collections I read all the way through and loved, followed by The Crow. As a kid, I loved The Iron Man. So there was all kinds of, you know, complicated it was just more disappointment, really, more than anything. And so so I knew that Ted Hughes loves a nature-based extended metaphor, which is why I chose to personify the Mississippi River to speak back to Ted Hughes. Because when I read the poem, I happened to be in New Orleans by the river. So this is the Mississippi River speaking back to Ted Hughes. Yeah, I'll just read it. No one wise calls the river unaware or simple pools. No one wise says it lacks a dimension. No one wise says its body is removed from the vibration of air. The river is a quiet breath taker, gargling mud. Ted is alert and simple. Ted lacked a subtle waving aura of sound and responses to sound. Ted lived through his eyes, but I the colossal currents from the bridge, I riverboats ghosting a geography of fog. Mississippi means big river, named by French colonizers. The natives laughed at their arrogant maps, conquering wind and marking mist. The mouth of the river laughs. A man in a wetsuit emerges, pulls misty goggles over his head. Couldn't see a thing, he breathes heavily. My face was in darkness. No one heard him. The river drowned him out. And so when you see this poem in the book, it is a redacted, so it completely redacts the Ted Hughes poem. and I go into quite a lot of classrooms and deaf schools, and I often share this poem with students. And I think one of my favorite responses I ever got from this poem was when I showed this to again a room full of deaf students. One student puts up his hand and says, "Oh, sir, can you turn the book sideways?" It was like that. So he looks at it like that, and he says that this looks like his audiologist's computer screen, like audio channels, when he was having his cochlear implant put in. And that was something that kind of resonated with me. I never forgot that moment, because for me, it remains an example of creativity in the classroom, and how we can channel our anger and our ideas into and model kind of other ways of seeing the world and understanding language and each other. I will read the title poem, The Perseverance. I think there's always a moment when you're reading a poetry collection, when you get to the title poem, it asks you to be extra vigilant. Like, what's going on? Why is this the title poem? So this is called The Perseverance. The epigraph is from Peter Tosh, who was my dad's favorite singer. When my dad passed away, and I was thinking about him, I seem to have a lot of memories of being left outside the pub, this pub called The Perseverance. The Perseverance is in a part of East London, part of Hackney, which is still there despite pretty intense gentrification. Growing up, like, this was one of the poorest parts of London, right next to Tower Hamlets, so it's like the second poorest part of London, and now it's just thriving kind of hipster central kind of thing. So I was thinking a bit about that, how a piece of the language on this pub has persevered through time. And yeah, so this is the poem. Love is the man overstanding, Peter Tosh. I wait outside the Perseverance, just popping in here a minute. I'd heard him say it many times before, like all kids with a drinking father. Watch him disappear into smoke and laughter. There is no such thing as too much laughter, my father says, drinking in the Perseverance until everything disappears. I'm outside, counting minutes, waiting for the man, my father, to finish his shot and take me home before it gets dark. We'd been here before. No such thing as too much laughter, unless you're my mother without my father, working weekends while the Perseverance spits him out for a minute. He gives me 50p to make me disappear. 50p in my hand, I disappear like a coin in a parking meter before the time runs out. How many minutes will I lose listening to the laughter spilling from the Perseverance while strangers ask, where is your father? I stare at the doors and say, my father is working. Strangers who don't disappear, but hug me for my Perseverance. Dad said, this will be the last time before of a TV spilled canned laughter, us on the sofa in this council flat, knowing any minute the yams will boil. Any minute I will eat again with my father, who cooks and serves laughter, good as any Jamaican who disappeared from the island I tasted before overstanding our heat and Perseverance. I still hear popping in for a minute. See him disappear. We lose our fathers before we know it, and I am still outside the Perseverance, listening for the laughter. I just want to point out that the Perseverance is also an Irish pub, and my dad, for some reason, had some kind of affinity with, I guess, Irish people and some of the stereotypes around the drinking culture. He said, yeah, they're good to drink with because if you get into a fight with them and they knock you out, they'll buy your drink afterwards. There you go, stereotype, macho, Jamaican, Irish solidarity. I think I'm going to read a new poem. I'm going to try this. I haven't read this out yet, so let's see how this goes. One of my favorite poets happens to be Eibhlín Dubh, who passed away about a year ago now, and so many things in her work I resonate with. Her kind of revision of empire, her look at history, her look at story, her look at ballads, and the way in which she's often connecting her own personal history to the history of her nation, to Ireland, and its kind of colonial history as well. And I spent some time going back and looking for the graves, basically, of my ancestors, of my great grandmother and grandfather, and it happened to these particular cemeteries on my Antrobus side, so on my English side, on my mother's side. Sutton Road Cemetery is where I have quite a lot of ancestors of mine buried. So I'd actually gone there for the first time fairly recently, just before the pandemic had begun, and I sat by their grave, and I wrote this poem. It's called Sutton Road Cemetery, after Eibhlín Dubh. His mother had driven him back to London in the half-light. He sighed in the passenger seat. They stopped by the Southend seas as the wind picked up and clouds thinned into English women. All the stones had said nothing of their names as he skinned them wide across the waves. Earlier, when he'd found the grave of his great-grandmother by the elderberry tree, it was the one time he'd wanted someone white to appear and ask where he was from. It would have been no skin of him to point at her stone and say, "Here." I'm going to try another new one from the next book. Basically, a lot of these poems kind of start by thinking about my name, Antrobus. It's a very, very old English name. And it interests me that people in England always think that it's from somewhere else. They're always like, "Oh, this is an exotic name." And it's like, yeah, I've got a name that is so anciently English that it's become foreign to English people. That's been forever a kind of point of entry for me. I think that will always be a point of entry for me for the rest of my life. But again, I was thinking a bit about my kind of emotional history with my mother, and how that comes out. So I wrote this poem called "I Ran Away from Home to See How Long It Would Take My Mother to Notice." Are you my drunk teacher who took our game of rounders way too seriously? Are you the boy who said I had the ugliest smile on the playground? Are you the girl who toe-punted my balls and made me a piss sack of blood? The girlfriend who slept with other women behind my back said it wasn't cheating? I don't know what I'm saying. Would you be my friend? I spent hours in the house alone as a child. I left fingerprints on my sister's CDs so the music kept skipping. I wanted her friends to be my friends, but I wasn't invited to her parties. Are you the party? Are you my dad lying on the sofa saying I'll soon be dead? When I pull What is Existentialism off my mother's shelf, Simone de Beauvoir says, the movement of my transcendence appears futile. I don't know what that means, so I put it back. Fuck, who loves me? I'm testing everyone. I need space for all my old and new gooey needs and projections. I need constant blaring validation alarms. Give me award ceremonies. Please observe my wall of fame. Best second-guessing overachiever. Best internal monologue while drying dishes. Best self-promoter at the charity fundraiser. Best awkward silence in a moving vehicle. Best bad advice to a couple in crisis. Best non-smoker in the smoking area. Most self-centered fear during the global pandemic. Lifetime Achievement Award for most convincing head nod in a crowded pub. Most triggered person in an empty house. I think I'm just going to read one more and going back to the Perseverance. I think I'm going to read the last poem in the Perseverance, which is called Happy Birthday Moon. And I think when people ask me, what's been a difficult poem for you to write? This is a poem which I come to because its question was so large for me, which is, where for me did language begin? And I guess in terms of language, the English language, and in the real world, rather than the kind of internal world, language began for me, I think, with my dad reading me these children's picture books when I was a kid. And he was always a parent who would read to me. My mother would be working so hard; she'd be so tired by that time of me going to bed. And so my dad would read to me a book called Happy Birthday Moon. You may know it. It's a book about a bear who lives out in the forest, and on one particular night, he stands up on a hill overlooking a full moon, and the valleys and the trees are around him, and the bear says, "It's my birthday." And the bear's voice echoes through the valley, and he hears it again, "It's my birthday." And so the bear thinks that the moon is speaking to him. The bear thinks that it's the moon's birthday as well as his own. And so that sets up this device, kind of repetition that moves throughout the story, the book. And in some ways, the Perseverance is very much a book of repetition. Almost every form that's used throughout the book has some kind of repetition in it. So it was only right to kind of put this poem at the end with all of its repetition. And so anything else I should say about this book? Probably not, but I'll probably just say thank you for listening, and I can't wait to be in conversation with Doireann as well. Happy Birthday Moon. Dad reads aloud. I follow his finger across the page. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. He makes the moon say something new every night to his deaf son who slurs his speech. Sometimes his finger moves past words tracing white space. Tonight it gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. His deaf son who slurs his speech. Dad taps the page, says, try again. Tonight it gives the moon my name, but I can't say it. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs. Dad taps the page, says, try again. But I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. I say, Raymond Antrobus. He laughs, says, Raymond is something else. I like making him laugh. I say my mistake again. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us? He says, Raymond, there's something else. I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Raymond Antrobus. What else will help us hear each other, really hear each other? I'd like to be the moon, the bear, even the rain. Dad makes the moon say something new every night, and we hear each other, really hear each other. As Dad reads aloud, I follow his finger across the page. Thank you.
That was a wonderful reading. Thank you very much, Raymond. And there we go. There's Doireann clapping away. Hey. That is something that a lot of poets and authors are missing at these events. Being able to hear that audience response and see that people have enjoyed the event. But I can tell from the chat, if the audience was here, they would be happy. And indeed they are. Okay, we've got one question to kick off with. So the rest of the audience, get your questions in. Bill Swainson asks, Doireann and Raymond, how did you get started writing poems?
You go first, Raymond.
Go on.
You want me to go first?
After you.
Writing poetry. So, bizarrely, I have this rare privilege, which is having two parents who like poetry. Apparently, that's not a common thing. And as well as having two parents that loved poetry, even though they themselves weren't poets, or at least public poets, they both loved poets from their own kind of country and spoke to their own history in their own time. So my mother's favorite poet was William Blake, or is William Blake. My dad's favorite poet was Miss Lou's, Jamaican poet. And, I would have, like when I was growing up, on my wall, on my bedroom wall as a kid, I had London, William Blake's poem "London" on the wall, and my dad chose a poem to put on my wall called "The Song of the Banana Man." Called, I've forgotten his name. It was people thought that it was Claude McKay, but it wasn't. Claude McKay came a bit later, but yeah. So poetry always had this kind of presence around me, even though I wasn't really kind of being literally encouraged to write it, but it was something I did privately as a young person, as a kid, and I think, you know, by the time I got to school, I'd already had a kind of grounding in poetry, that it was something that I could relate to and do. So I didn't have the kind of intimidation that I think a lot of people have when their first encounter with poetry is in a classroom, looking at ambient pentameter, Shakespeare sonnets, and it's just kind of like, what is this? So because I'd already had, you know, I was already relating it with my family, it just kind of shielded me in a way from other ideas, I think, for poetry. So poetry has very much been this thing that I could do confidently, and I guess, I don't know, it was such an accident. It really was. I don't ever remember consciously thinking I'm going to be a poet. It was just this thing that I kept doing. But and then when I got to about 19, 20 years old, I started doing kind of performance poetry and slam poetry, and then that kind of built into a whole kind of real life network of poets and community. I then got invited to not only to do readings, but also found out about all the different organizations, and then I started being given opportunities. So again, I'm really young when this is happening. So it's just something that, as well as the passion, I also had opportunities that came my way when I was young that sustained me in poetry.
Thank you for such a full answer.
Yeah, I remember reading an interview with Raymond at one stage where he made not the comparison is the wrong way of saying it, but where he said something like that poetry almost felt like his first language in some ways to him. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, no, you are remembering that right. That was like a headline. Yeah, it is a kind of love language, right? Because I get to associate poetry with all of these kind of identities and histories and times that kind of feed into a narrative that I guess I tell myself, you know, about and that's why I was talking about even a poet like Even Boland, or my mother also loved Adrian Mitchell, you know, Tell Me Lies About Vietnam, like very spoken and poetry that's taken a stand, as well as like self-affirmation poetry, as well as lyric poetry. So I just see that when people talk about poetry nowadays, it means different things to different people, and I can usually see this kind of these camps. But poetry in itself, I think, I spoke with Ilya Kaminsky about this once, and I think he just says, no, poetry is a country in itself. It's a place we visit. It's a place we can all be citizens of poetry. I like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. What was the question? Was the question how did we? I just got so into that answer. I'm sorry, I forgot. I think it was Bill who asked, was it?
Don't worry, it was Bill, and he was saying, "How did you get into writing poetry?" And there was nothing wrong with the answer growing beyond that. We like
sorry,
it.
I just got carried away in that. I think I'm very different from Raymond in some ways there, because poetry came to me in adulthood. I was in my late 20s before I ever wrote a poem. So I think that maybe it's why that a line from Raymond's interview stuck in my head about it being in some ways like his first language, because that felt so, I'm just in awe of that, you know, because it came so late for me, and it felt like that experience where you attempt to learn a new language as an adult. And you just get so into it and so carried away in it, but in some way you're always learning from the outside in, and the thoughts of having that experience, like it just sounds to me like Raymond is more like a born poet, you know, like even as a child, like that's such a rare and beautiful thing to have, you know. And I suppose for me it was much more like kind of like trying to teach myself something. And that comes with its own sense of astonishment, because I think sometimes we come to expect as adults that, oh, this is it, this is life now. But life always has some kind of weird surprise, whether welcome or not. That life always seems to have some kind of weird surprise in store for us. And that was one thing that I really did not see coming. Yeah, I only came to poetry in adulthood. So but it has taught me so much, and I find it interesting to think of it like a language, because it allows you to speak in a different way, doesn't it? But it also allows you to see in a different way. So yeah, late is my short answer to that question. Late.
Two excellent answers. Thank you very much. Okay, next question. This one is from Tom Ryan, and he's asking you both, what poem always lifts your mood? I think that's quite a good question for the current circumstances.
Great question. I've got one. I'll take this one first if you want, Raymond.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I again, like, I've come very late to the habit of keeping a notebook, but I'm taking great joy in it. So one of the things that sometimes I make a note of a line in this, and I've been reading a lot of Doireann Ní Ghríofa, an American poet's work, and I love it. It's just so, just trying not to curse there, but like it's really it's really, really strange and spectacular, and it kind of ties you in mental knots. And I have a page here in my notebook that I don't know if you can see. No, you probably can't see it. I'll read it out. I was painting with the kids during homeschool the other day, and I did a little painting around it as well. I can't paint either. And it's only 4 lines long. It's so simple, but like, listen out for how weird it is as well. Remember my little granite pail. The handle of it was blue. Think what got away in my life was enough to carry me through. It's pretty weird, like, because when I first read that poem, like, I think what's got away in my life was enough to carry me through. I thought it was how the little pail was enough to carry her through, in that sense of being carried with that, but it's what got away was enough to carry her through. I'm still trying to understand this poem, Tom, and I don't quite understand it yet, but I do keep coming back to it. And so it's giving me comfort in a weird messing with your head kind of a way. So not in the traditional kind of, it's not a consoling poem, it's more a poem that I'm still trying to understand and keeps drawing me back. And I kind of find that cool and exciting. So
I love that. I think that depending on the day and the time, I would answer this question differently. So right now, I've during this pandemic, like, I think I've turned to poetry really as a kind of escape. It really has been like looking for this kind of ethereal, otherworldly kind of place. And so recently I've been turning back to Rilke. So I'm going to read a poem which every time, like what Doireann says there about, like, you get something different from this poem every time you hear it. For me, it is true. I am, oh anxious one, don't you hear my voice surging forth with all my earthly feelings? They yearn so high, but they have sprouted wings and whitely fly in circles around your face. My soul, dressed in silence, rises up and stands alone before you. Can't you see? Don't you know that my prayer is growing ripe upon your vision as upon a tree? If you are the dreamer, I am what you dream. But when you want to wake, I am your wish, and I grow strong with all magnificence and turn myself into a star's vast silence above the strange and distant city, time. I mean, Rilke, you have to give it to him. You just have to give it to him. So I've found a lot of comfort in him. But not in a way that's like, oh, this is uplifts me. This is just kind of escapist poetry for me.
Brilliant. Thank you both. We're not going to have time for any more questions because we've already hit 6 o'clock, which is such a shame because we've still got loads. Oh, no. Thank you, everybody who's given your questions. Even if we couldn't get a chance to answer them, thank you for them. And thank you, Doireann and Raymond, for 2 brilliant readings and a really interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you for coming to LitFest, even if it's not in the room digitally. It was still just as good. Thank you. And now I better wrap up.
Yeah.
This is the 3rd of our 4 Poetry Day events, so there is still more to come. I'm not sure if you can still hear me. that briefly closed my internet. No, I'm here.
Yeah.
Okay. There is still more to come from us. And as I said earlier, if you enjoy our events, please, before we go our separate ways, consider clicking on that donate button at the bottom of the screen or going to our website, which is www.litfest.org. And as I mentioned earlier, many of the titles that have been included within this festival from our wonderful authors are available from the LitFest bookshop on that website. And buying a book will also contribute to our work. And many of them, handily, include a free book plate signed by the author in most cases, where it has been possible to arrange. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you later at our final poetry event and possibly at our storytelling finale tomorrow. If there's any events during this festival that you have missed or come too late or now think you might have liked to watch, just pop over to our YouTube channel because they're all on there for 30 days. Thank you so much to our poets today, and we hope to see you again at LitFest soon. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.